Right. Well, hello. We are at chapter 4, the Anglo Saxons. History is often repetitive, and one historical drama that has been played out repeatedly in human history is the fall of empires. Rome, for all its might, was no exception. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire was collapsing due to a combination of external threats and infighting. As things went from bad to worse, the remote island province of Britannia was far down the list of priorities for Rome. Around 410 CE, the Roman legions were removed from Britain to deal with threats on the continent, and the legions never returned. Britain did not break out of Roman rule. It was thrown to the side by the Romans. Having a conquering empire set you free with no bloodshed might sound great. But, as we discussed in the last chapter, the Celtic Britons had become rather Romanized. What's more, being a Roman province came with a crucial benefit: Roman legions, soldiers. Without the legions to protect them, the Celtic Britons were left to defend themselves against all sorts of invaders. Three main groups took advantage of Britain without Roman legions: the Picts of Scotland, the Scotti of Ireland, and the Anglo Saxons from the continent. Eventually, the Anglo Saxons moved past raiding to settling until the land of Britain became England, the land of the Angles. The arrival of the Anglo Saxons. With the arrival of the Anglo Saxons, we are finally getting to the English part of English history. But who exactly were the Anglo Saxons? According to early sources, the Anglo Saxons were a group consisting of three different tribes of settlers from the continent: the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. The Angles and Saxons were Germanic tribes, and the Jutes were a Norse tribe. These tribes came from northern Europe and settled in southeastern and southern Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries. We do not have exact dates for the arrival of Anglo-Saxons. Like the Celtic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons did not have a written language for some time. And as we discussed earlier, the lack of written records leaves historians with a harder job. We know very little about what happened in Britain from around 400 CE, when the Romans departed, to around 600 CE. By this time, 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, known as the Heptarchy, had emerged. This means that the sources we have about the Anglo-Saxon settlement were written long after the events. These traditional sources, such as the Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in the 8th century, say that the Anglo-Saxons conquered southern Britain in a reign of terror between 400 and 600, annihilating the Celtic tribes and forcing the survivors to flee to what would become the Celtic nations of Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany in France. While it is certain the Anglo-Saxons were not nice to the Celtic Britons, they stole their land, it is less certain whether the Anglo-Saxons committed genocide on the scale we originally thought. Another more likely possibility is forced assimilation. The Anglo-Saxons looked down on the Celtic Britons, forcing them into the lowest tier of societies as they conquered the land. As a result, the Celtic Britons likely merged into Anglo-Saxon society to avoid social isolation and discrimination. So, through a mixture of forced migration, assimilation, and murder, the Celtic Britons were replaced by these invaders from northern Europe. By the 7th century, the Anglo Saxons had consolidated into 7 main kingdoms: Mercia, Northumberland, Wessex, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia. Anglo-Saxon culture. Flying here. Anglo-Saxons were here to stay. Maybe it's one from Spain. Still, Anglo-Saxons were here to stay. But what were they like? Writing did not come to the Anglo-Saxons until their conversion to Christianity, so we have no written records of the early Anglo-Saxon period. Later, after writing was introduced, there was still relatively little reliable information about these people. Many of the writings from the time have clear biases and inaccuracies that make them difficult to take completely at face value. This lack of information has caused the Anglo-Saxon period in English history to be known as the Dark Ages. But this is a misleading name based on a biased view. The term Dark Ages is meant to describe a regression of human civilization. A dark age is a time of ignorance and barbarity. But assigning the name Dark Ages to the Anglo-Saxon period has far more to do with the Romans than the Anglo-Saxons. During the Renaissance, the period immediately following the Middle Ages, society saw a renewed interest and veneration for classical Greek and Roman culture. Rome was even seen as the birthplace of Western civilization. With such a high view of Rome, it was only natural to assume that their departure from the island of Britain would set its society back. The fact that there were no written historical records to contradict this view did not help matters. The Anglo-Saxons were viewed as a brutish people for historians for a long time. However, as research on this era has continued and we have learned more about the Anglo-Saxons, we now know that such a view is not only biased but also not true. As with Britain's prehistory, archaeology has taught us much of what we need to know about the Anglo-Saxons. Burial sites such as Sutton Hoo show that the Anglo-Saxons had a rich and sophisticated culture. They buried some of their dead with many grave goods, indicating both a social hierarchy and a large amount of wealth. Subsistence farmers, barely scraping by, could not afford to bury their dead with gold, jewellery, weapons, and more. A helmet from an Anglo-Saxon dig at Sutton Hoo. Therefore, we now know that the Anglo-Saxons were a successful and complex society. That being said, Anglo-Saxon life could also be brutal. Anglo-Saxons lived in tribal societies that placed great emphasis on kingship and honour. These values translated into a culture where killing to avenge family members was quite common. The Anglo-Saxons developed vergild, a system that set a price on a person's life so that monetary compensation could be made for murder. This was necessary to stop the endless cycle of murders caused by a society that demanded honour and revenge. Warfare is also a common part of Anglo-Saxon life. Remember that Anglo-Saxons were technically invaders from the continent. To establish their kingdoms, they had to seize land from the Celtic Britons. Tradition says that the Celtic forces that resisted the Anglo-Saxon invasions were led by the legendary King Arthur, although we don't have any evidence that such a person existed. Regardless, the Anglo Saxons certainly used military might to seize control of the island, and even after they had gained control, warfare continued. By the 7th century, 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms shared the southeastern region of a small island. There were also Welsh kingdoms to the west and Scottish kingdoms to the north. With so many competing groups crammed into a small geographical area, competition for resources like land often became violent. Warfare was also tempting because it led to great gains. Stronger kingdoms could demand tribute from their weaker neighbours. People captured in conflicts could be used or sold as slaves. And treasure and resources could be seized from defeated opponents. In the Anglo-Saxon world, warfare was economics. That doesn't mean that the Anglo-Saxons spent all their time fighting. This was still the era of human history where, if human society was to survive, most people needed to be farmers. So, daily life for most Anglo-Saxons would have involved working the land. Life wasn't all working and fighting for the Anglo-Saxons, though. They also had entertainment. For instance, poetry was a large part of Anglo-Saxon culture. Because of its rhythm, poetry is easier to memorise and to listen to, making it excellent entertainment for people without television or easy access to books. The most famous Anglo-Saxon poem is the epic Beowulf, something I got taught in school, which follows the titular hero through his adventures slaying monsters and is quite complicated to read, to say the least. Other examples of Anglo-Saxon poetry include Caedemon's hymn The Seafarer and the Battle of Maldon. These poems tell us a lot about what Anglo-Saxon culture valued. Poems like Beowulf and the Battle of Maldon both tell tales of heroes who ultimately fall in battle. This tells us that the Anglo-Saxons viewed warfare as more than economic gain. There was a perceived honour in being a warrior and falling in battle. On the other hand, the Anglo-Saxons wrote poems like Caedemon's hymn and The Seafarer. Caedemon's hymn is, as the name implies, a hymn praising God. The Seafarer is from a genre called wisdom poetry that describes the ups and downs of life. The Seafarer tells the tale of an exile at sea who must wait for the glory of heaven to find his redemption. As you can tell from these last two poems, Christian values were part of Anglo-Saxon culture. The Anglo-Saxon conversion to Christianity is a key factor in understanding who they were and how they impacted England. Conversion to Christianity. Christianity brought writing to the Anglo-Saxons and allowed the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to claim a place in the grand scheme of European politics. Christian tradition says that Joseph of Arimathea, these flies, take the Spanish flies away. I won't say the name. Those things. I'll start again. Christian tradition says that Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb Jesus was laid in after his crucifixion, brought Christianity to Britain during the time of the Romans, but there is no historical evidence to support this claim. A later legend says that Pope Gregory I sent Augustine in 597 to convert the Anglo-Saxons after remarking on the beauty of Angle boys in the slave market at Rome. While Augustine may have acted as a missionary to the English, we can hardly give him credit for bringing Christianity to England, as it was already on the island in the Roman age. Irish missionaries likely also played a part in converting the Anglo-Saxons. However it arrived, Christianity spread gradually over the island and had huge influence on the Anglo-Saxons. It changed their holidays, rituals, and even their values. The church would soon be involved in a person's life from birth to marriage to death. For an entire society to change its religious convictions, the ruling class must also change. As we will see much later in English history, it is very difficult to maintain a functioning government system when a ruler and the people are of different religions. Part of the reason Christianity took such a hold on the Anglo-Saxons may therefore be because their rulers were converted. Many Anglo-Saxon kings converted to Christianity because of the belief of the benefits it offered them. One of those benefits sounds relatively simple, but has far-reaching implications, and that is writing. Christian monks and missionaries were a literate group in a largely illiterate time. Their ability to write allowed the Anglo-Saxon kings they served to make laws and send orders across large areas. Writing made the transmission of information far easier and more accurate, letting kings effectively rule much larger areas. There were many other benefits that the rulers of Anglo-Saxon society gained from Christianity. Rituals like assigning godparents let rulers easily connect themselves with other ruling families. The church and other religious institutions, like monasteries, also gave rulers another place to appoint people loyal to themselves. Having bishops and monks loyal to the king scattered throughout a kingdom was another way that Christianity helped Anglo-Saxon kings consolidate and grow their power. To understand why Christianity could offer Anglo-Saxon kings so much power, we need to consider that, previously, there were few public institutions involved in a person's daily life. Anglo-Saxons were concerned with their kin, but beyond the ties of blood, there was little connecting them to their neighbours or rulers. Christianity brought a uniform institution to the Anglo-Saxons. With Christianity, everyone across a kingdom was worshipping at the same time and in the same way. Churches also became important community centres for events like baptisms, marriages and burials. Monasteries began to function as centres of charity in communities. Thus, Christianity provided institutions that united the Anglo-Saxons more firmly. The more firmly the people were united, the easier it was for the ruling class to expand its power. However, it was not ultimately Christianity, but something else entirely, that at last united the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single kingdom known as England. And we should go on to that in the next chapter with the Viking raids and the formation of England.